Good evening, everybody. My name's Robin Ewing, and with Professor Michael Anderson, I co-direct the Create Centre. Creativity in research, engaging the arts, transforming education, health, and wellbeing. We're very excited to have you all here tonight. But before I tell you a little bit about Create and Michael introduces our wonderful presenters, it's my privilege to acknowledge the original custodians of our land, our First Nations Australians. And I want to pay respect and acknowledge that they have looked after our land very well. I also want to acknowledge that our First Nations Australians put arts and creativity and story at the centre of their lives and learning. And I believe we have so much to learn from them. I also want to acknowledge that our land, that their land was never ceded. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I just want to tell you a little bit about the Create Centre. Tonight is in the webinar is an example of our public facing strand. We have online conferences and webinars and roundtables. We also work in partnership with arts and health and education organisations, and we research with our partners to further investigate the importance of creativity and the arts and the and current issues in those areas. We also are involved in professional learning and, of course, in advocacy. We'd really like to encourage you, if you're not already members of Create, to join Create and also to have a look at our past work, which is all curated on the Create YouTube channel. So please think about that. We'd also encourage you to talk with us if you're interested in presenting a webinar or an online conference. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Michael Anderson.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome everyone. So great to see you all spending an evening with us. We're so pleased to have you here. We're also really pleased to welcome Professor Sandra Gattenhof and Dr. Donna Hancox to talk to us about cultural and creative engagement as enablers of wellbeing and social inclusion. This, of course, is of incredible interest to Create because it is basically the remit of Create to be thinking about how the arts are enablers of wellbeing and social inclusion, and how creativity in the arts can be used in education, health, wellbeing, and all sorts of places. So there could not be a more on message kind of discussion than the one we're going to have tonight. So thank you, Sandra and Donna, for agreeing to be part of this tonight. I want to introduce briefly Sandra and Donna. Their bios are on the event page if you want to read more about them. But of course, Sandra has spent the past 20 years working and researching in the arts and cultural engagement. She's the Director of Research and Training in the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice at Queensland University of Technology. She is also the recipient of the incredibly prestigious Drama Australia Award. Donna Hancox is an Associate Professor in the Faculty of Creative Industries, Education and Social Justice at QUT. She's the co-leader of the Creative Placemaking for Social Impact Research Group and a Chief Investigator on the ARC grant on social impact of the arts in Australian regional communities. And she is, very excitingly, a Fulbright Senior Scholar, and that will take her to interesting places next year, even outside Queensland. So welcome to you both. we're really excited to have you here, and thank you so much for presenting to Create and its membership. Over to you, Donna and Sandra.
Thank you so much, Michael and Robin, and thank you to the members of the Create Centre for inviting us to chat with you this evening. And as Michael said, we're looking at the notion of wellbeing and social inclusion that's developed as a result of, or through, or with creative and cultural engagement. Before we begin, Donna and I are presenting in Meanjin this evening, Meanjin, Brisbane, and we do want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are speaking from this evening, the Turrbal and Yagara people, as the First Nations owners of the lands in which we are situated and where our university QUT stands. Donna and I pay our respects to elders, laws, customs and creation spirits, and recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. And we also acknowledge the continuing and important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples play within the QUT community. So we're going to take you through a little bit of a whirlwind adventure of our project and some of the emergent outcomes of the project. So we're 2 years into it and we go into our third and final year of our project next year. So everything we talk about is provisional this evening. We're seeing some very interesting and exciting threads and ideas beginning to emerge, but we can't absolutely establish those until we've finished a couple of more rounds of consultation with our communities and then worked with our partners to solidify what those outcomes are. But you'll get a sense of where we are and how significant this research is within Australia and perhaps even internationally. So Donna and I are going to tag team it and I'm going to lead off here. So our project, which is an ARC linkage grant, and for those that are not in Australia, ARC is the Australian Research Council, and it's one of the really major funding bodies for research in Australia, not just in the arts, but across a variety of different areas. So it's a very significant achievement to get one of these grants, and a linkage is a difficult grant to get because it's dependent on you getting a sequence of partners to provide both cash and in-kind support for the project. So there's a lot of negotiation, and it really took us maybe 2.5 years to get this project together before we could even get on the ground and do some stuff. So on the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see our 7 project partners. And we didn't go for low-hanging fruit because we really believe that what we're doing has the potential to influence policy change. And Donna and I have always been very clear from the very beginning of any project that we do. It's not just about the community and the individuals that we're working in, but it has to be positioned in a much larger conversation. So we've got some big heavy hitters there. You can see the Federal Office of the Arts, Regional Arts Australia, which are a major funding and think tank within Australia in terms of the delivery of arts experiences with, for and by regional communities in Australia. The Regional Institute of Australia, who are predominantly an economic and policy think tank, but they're beginning to get really interested in the arts courtesy of our project. The Central Western Queensland Remote Area Planning and Development Board, otherwise known as RAPID, and we'll talk about who they are in a minute. Red Ridge, Interior Queensland, Burnie Regional Council, and then Performing Arts Connections Australia, which was formerly known as PAC. So we've got a number of organisations that work in and around the arts, both across policy development and across funding, federal level and national level. Well, they're the same things. Well done, Sandra, already. But what's really important is we've got local partners out in Central Western Queensland and in the Burnie area. And really this project for Donna and I was an opportunity, and for the communities that we work with, an opportunity to really re-language and rethink the way that the arts might become a way in which communities can address some of the significant problems that are like drought, unemployment, low educational attainment, particularly in secondary schooling, those kind of things, that the arts might be a way to help those communities think differently about what those impacts might be. And there were two key aims in this project. And the first one was to help communities develop a comprehensive, contemporary and rigorous language framework to account for the multiplicity of ways that the arts and culture are understood across diverse communities. So currently what we have in Australia is pretty much a one-size-all-fits model in terms of understanding the impact of the arts and reporting on the arts. And particularly if you're working in the funding situation, that can become very difficult because it's not nuanced and it doesn't really speak to our regional communities. It's very metro or urban centric. And then the second thing was to use that framework to account for the success factors that we see in communities, and what we're talking about tonight around wellbeing and social inclusion are two of them. But then to be able to use that understanding and those language frameworks to help communities speak beyond their communities to gain further economic investment to continue the arts practice within their communities. So where are we situated? We are very fortunate to work across two very dynamic communities that are geographically very different and economically very different, but have a whole lot of similarities that we'll talk to you about in a minute. So the project works across two sites, and we're on Inangai country, Matadai country, Kunkari and Bidjara lands in central Western Queensland. And that's centred around the towns of Longreach, Buckhaldon, Blackhall and Tambo. If you are not from Australia or you are not Queensland centric, those lands are roughly 2 hours flying time or about 12 hours driving from Brisbane. So they're quite a way away from us. And then our other site is in northwest Tasmania on Palawa country in La Chihuita, the communities of Burnie, Wynyard and Smithton. And you can see those images there really tell you that one is a very dry, almost desert community, which is our central Western Queensland community. And then the other one is a coastal community. They're very, very different, but have lots of similarities. So what we're really interested in is the metrics for success. How do we know when arts, culture and creativity create success outcomes for those communities? And last year, Wesley Enoch talked about this very eloquently. And he said metrics for success are already skewing from qualitative to quantitative. In coming years, this will continue unabated, with impact measured by the numbers of eyeballs engaged in transitory exposure or mass distraction, rather than deep connection, community development and risk. And really what he's saying there is that there's a whole lot of other attributions that the arts can make beyond numbers, beyond the metrics of how many tickets did we sell, how many people were in the theatre, how many nights did they spend in a hotel, how much money did they spend in local restaurants, which are the current metrics that a lot of governments use to measure the success of the arts. And really what we're looking at are things like what's beginning to come up is value in terms of cultural maintenance, or value in terms of identity creation, or value in terms of reimagining places and futures, or value as a safe space for questioning structures or social norms. So really we're looking at what Brown and Trimboli talk about are these comprehensive pictures of the alterations in the quality of life. So what they're talking about is, how does life change for the better, or maybe for the worse, as a result of engagement in art, culture and creativity? I'm going to hand over to Donna.
Thank you, Sandra. If you can just move the slide. Thank you. So Sandra has talked about some of the what, the how, and the why of this project. And I'll start the conversation about some of our initial findings. And this quote here, which is the key idea, is actually from an ARC linkage project that was just ending as ours was beginning. And there's this lovely thread that runs between the two of them. And it was the Creative Berkeley project. And this is a quote from one of their publications that was led by Bridie Lee Bartlett. And one of the findings there was the social and cultural contributions that art and culture and creativity make to communities cannot be separated from the economic outcomes. And so our research is really concerned with demonstrating some of those ways that arts, culture, and creativity are really completely entwined with the economic and social success of communities, and what that looks like in communities. And it can be different across different communities, we're finding, but we are finding those similarities of what that looks like. And we're finding that arts, culture, and creativity draw people to regional and remote communities, or also when we say regional, you know, we're thinking about communities that are on the outer areas of metropolitan cities. And so communities that aren't always the first place that people move to, so that they can draw people to communities. They can encourage people to stay in those communities. They provide opportunities for creative entrepreneurship. And they're also really powerful avenues for social cohesion, wellbeing, and problem solving. So when we talk about the elements of thriving communities in Australia, we often talk about education, health, business, the environment, infrastructure, all of which are really crucial. But we also need to consider the ways that arts, culture, and creativity continue to contribute and are central to those ideas of community success. So this whole of community approach and whole of community success is starting to be evidenced by the themes that are emerging across our research. And these are based on a series of one-on-one interviews and also 6 community engagement workshops across both of the sites. So we've done our first round of data collection and we've got the findings from there, and we'll go back early next year. That sounds very optimistic, doesn't it? We'll probably get to Central Western Queensland, definitely, and hopefully we'll be in Tasmania early next year as well to continue to build on our findings. But at this stage, the early themes that are emerging are these: social inclusion and wellbeing, understanding there's an ecosystem approach to arts, culture, and creativity, and sustainability and innovation. We're going to talk a little bit about each of these tonight and how they all intersect. So we don't see those themes as being separate from one another, but they actually intersect to create this holistic approach to community wellbeing. And it's worth kind of echoing what Sandra said at the beginning, that one of the central aims of this research is for us to work alongside communities to articulate what the impact is for them of arts, culture, and creativity, and to make sure that their voices, their experiences, and their community-led solutions actually reach the ears of policymakers as well. So when we proposed this project, we did it because we really believed as a team already that arts, culture, and creativity have a central but often invisible role in the overall health of communities. And as Sandra said, we're 2 years in and we're realising that we probably actually underestimated how central arts, culture, and creativity are. And we're also starting to see that, or we knew this beforehand, but it's becoming clearer, is that the impact of the arts on communities, and in particular regional, rural, and remote communities, is too often overlooked, or it's undervalued, or it's dismissed by policymakers, by funding bodies, by the arts sector in general, and particularly the metropolitan arts sector, which does most of the funding. That what that impact looks like is just not really part of how they think about funding or how they think about arts and culture. However, we can guarantee you that it's absolutely not misunderstood or overlooked by local government areas, by community organisations and community members. And when we started writing this grant application, we're looking at existing policy frameworks around funding for the arts in communities, and was there a sense of how that worked in with other policy areas. And we found that there was a whole of government approach and a whole of government task force for regional Australia that included pretty much every portfolio except the arts, which sat outside of it. And, you know, it's really time for researchers, funding bodies and policymakers to understand that the arts is a crucial part of all of those areas that make up community success. And also we're finding that these impacts and the benefits of arts, culture and creativity are not necessarily experienced in the same way across all communities, that there are local differences that are influenced by location, remoteness, the place, the size, and also the investment, both from local government and state government into the arts, that impacts how they experience some of the benefits of arts, culture and creativity in their communities around social inclusion and wellbeing. And each of our research sites have really specific strengths and challenges as well that inform their approach to arts, culture and creativity and informs how it impacts those communities. Next slide, please. So this slide there's not a lot of words, but they're really important, you know, that across the community consultations that ideas of collective wellbeing, pride, hope, belonging and social cohesion kept coming up over and over again in all of our interviews and all of our community engagement workshops as what the participants saw as some of the benefits of arts and culture in their communities. And it's easy to sometimes dismiss these kinds of benefits as though, of course, people feel better after going to an arts activity or going to doing something creative. And to not really drill down and see just how beneficial and crucial these activities and projects are in communities, and particularly for communities like our two research sites. So I said they had specific challenges, and Central Western Queensland has been drought declared for, I think over a decade now. And that is not an insignificant situation to live under. It is incredibly difficult for people living on the land, not just around their livelihoods, but also their mental health, and also seeing the land that they love and live on to, you know, at times just feel as though it's dying around them. And that Central West area also has one of the highest rates of youth unemployment in the country. And then the northwest of Tasmania, and Sandra touched on this, has some of the lowest high school completion rates and some of the highest rates of intergenerational welfare as well. So there are certainly challenges, but they don't define those communities at all. And what we're seeing is that those communities are really starting to show us and lead the way of harnessing the cultural assets and resources in their communities to start to really address those specific issues. Thanks, Sandra. So when we think about social inclusion and wellbeing as part of the key benefits of arts, culture and creativity in communities, we're also starting to really understand that this doesn't work in isolation to a whole range of other benefits in those communities. And so what we're really starting to see is this idea of an ecosystem approach to arts, culture and creativity. And I'll talk a little bit specifically about some projects in a moment to show how that ecosystem starts to work. But we're seeing that arts, culture and creativity cannot be seen as separate from other aspects of community activity. So when we think about business development, when we think about access to education, improving education in regional, rural and remote communities, access to health services and trying to make sure that there are ways for people to be able to connect with necessary health services, that arts, culture and creativity aren't seen as something on the side to that. They're not understood as something nice to do on the weekend, but there's all of these other really crucial, urgent issues. They are completely entwined with one another. And looking at that, going back to that idea of social inclusion and wellbeing, you know, we're seeing in communities where community health organisations are working really closely with arts organisations and cultural venues to put on events where people can feel safe and feel as though they are able to have a relaxed atmosphere, do some activities, and then also where mental health nurses are also able to provide information about some of the services that they may be interested in. And to be able to target these to particular parts of the community. So there might be one specifically, there's a Channel Country Ladies Day where they do art and talk about also how they're going and have access to different kinds of women's health services there. And also where there's a particular leatherworking workshop that happens at a kind of 5 ways right between a whole lot of small towns and properties that young men in particular off those properties come to, who are working as jackaroos and spend a day doing leather work, but also talking about how they might be able to access some services around mental health, around drug and alcohol use as well. And so they're seen as really important binders of communities to be able to bring them together and talk about some really shared and common issues and challenges. So obviously then we're finding that our research is finding that strong community-led, and that's really crucial, that this isn't fly-in, fly-out arts activities where a metropolitan arts organisation with the very best intentions is funded to fly into a community to deliver a project and then leave again. That is not what communities are looking for, and it's also not the type of arts activities that have sustainable benefits for communities as well. So we're finding that strong community-led arts and culture activities and an arts and cultural sector is really a key driver in resilient and cohesive communities. And what we see is that there's a complex and robust network of local arts activities that have been ongoing for a number of years that then seed and support high profile outcomes that draw attention and businesses to communities, and that through these ongoing sustainable activities and projects, communities are able to then develop over time entrepreneurial skills, local leadership and social connection, and avenues for creative problem solving as well, which is really crucial. So I'll talk briefly about some of those examples. If you can go to the next slide, please, Sandra. So how these small local networks and projects then seed much bigger, much more sustainable and much more beneficial projects. There's a couple. So one is one of our partners who Sandra talked about is Red Ridge Interior, and they're a small but mighty organisation based. It's the only way really. They are small but mighty. I never miss an opportunity to say that I think that it's some of the best practice, most exciting work that I've seen in a really long time, and it's coming out of the main street of Blackall in central West Queensland. And Red Ridge Interior was seeded as a project by RAPID, which Sandra talked about, which is the Remote Area Planning and Development Board. They had never funded an arts project before. They fund amazing projects that are often about economic sustainability, looking at environmental sustainability in that area. And they had never funded an arts project, and the director of Red Ridge, Louise Campbell, had presented an idea, and she knew from the beginning that the arts are the glue that holds those communities together, and that when the arts organisations connect with economic development, mental health, education, that something really powerful can happen. So Red Ridge has a range of projects, and those projects I talked about previously, the Channel Country Ladies Day and the leatherworking, are both Red Ridge projects. But one of the other projects that they have that comes under them is Red Ridge the Label. And Red Ridge the Label has two main designers, Arnie Joyce and Arnie Jean, who are from Blackall, Tambo and Birdsville, and they're elders in that community, and they are local artists and had always had a dream of also being fashion designers. And through Red Ridge, they now have a label. That label has become incredibly successful. It sells out almost as soon as they put anything new up on the website. They will sell out a whole range of dresses to London. Our state arts minister, Leanne Enoch, is nearly always wearing Redbridge the label when she's in public. And what's interesting about that is when you go to Blackall and Barcaldine and you go to the local arts and crafts, or you go to the Aboriginal, Central West Aboriginal Corporation, or you go to one of the local shops on the main street, there's some connection to Redbridge the label. So the local arts and crafts ladies will have a morning and they'll be doing and sewing and making things for Redbridge the label. A woman who owns a little boutique on the main street will also, while she's in the shop, will be sewing for Redbridge the label. And you'll go to the Central West Aboriginal Corporation, and out the back will be some paintings that will end up being the next set of designs on the dresses for Redbridge the label. So Redbridge the label is the front of that, and there's been another really great project called Dress the West as well that is based around wearable art that also sits in that ecosystem. And while those two have been very much been, you know, on the catwalks, and there was an exhibition of Dress the West at the State Library Queensland, what sits under that is all of the community working and supporting to make sure that those succeed. And what that means is that it's success for everybody. And they talk about that all the time, that when those projects succeeds, the whole community succeeds. And another example is, and it's the photo here, is Artisanal Originals, which is in the main street of Barcaldine. And a few of the locals, one of whom happens to be the local community mental health nurse, had realised a couple of things at the same time. One was that there are a lot of empty shops on the main street, and the other was that there was a lot of talent and creativity in Barcaldine as well, and there was nowhere really for people to sell their work, to actually maybe for women who were living on properties to be able to make and then also have an income from their arts and crafts. So they organised to have one of the shops where they set up Artisanal Originals, which is full of local arts and crafts, and it's almost impossible to go to Blackall and Barcaldine without spending a lot of money because the products are just so stunning. And it provides a place for people to come. When you go into the shop, there's always people milling around and chatting, and they're having a coffee out the back, and the people who make the products are behind the counter and will tell you about everything that's in the shop. So it's become this real hub. And then as an offshoot, they started to realise that there was also a need for people who perhaps weren't making and didn't want to sell to have a similar kind of place to be. And there was another need that there was no thrift shop in Barcaldine. So the same group spearheaded and lobbied and got funding from a philanthropic body to set up the first op shop, which they called the Shopportunity, in Barcaldine. And so they get donations, and they're able to then make sure that people who may feel isolated and don't feel comfortable making and selling their work can go to the Shopportunity and fold clothes and work behind the counter. So it becomes the next part of that ecosystem. What sits above that is all of the profits from the Shopportunity go directly back into the community, and currently all of the profits are going to a retirement village there that needed upgrading, and there wasn't enough money, so all of the funds from the Shopportunity are going there. So there's this ecosystem where all of the parts work together for the community to thrive and understand all of the different elements of the community that are needed. So I'm going to hand back to Sandra now.
Thank you. So Donna started to talk about this idea of sustainability that is linked into this notion of the ecosystem. So that's why Donna, at the beginning of this presentation, said that these are not siloed ideas. They work in an integrated way. And what we're seeing is you can't have one idea without the other. So not only are we seeing that the arts, culture and creativity are intimately linked with wellbeing, social inclusion and economic outcomes for communities, but we're also seeing that these three themes are nested. They work in concert with each other. And usually when we talk about sustainability and innovation, it's always in the sense of economic drivers. or you know, industry innovation. And we're not using these terms in that way at all. We would often refer to these terms as thrivability. So what makes these communities places where people can thrive? And Donna's expressed that through that ecosystem model, and how those small kind of craft-based ideas become much greater objects, art objects, if you like. And one of the, well, two of the examples that I can give you there is that one, so Central West Aboriginal Corporation, who are in Barcaldine, have always wanted to share local stories, but really didn't have a platform to do it. They didn't know how to do it. And for a long time didn't feel welcome in the community to do it. And what they were able to do was to borrow some of the expertise and skills from Red Ridge in terms of the fashion label, sewing, pattern making, designing, all of those sort of things. And they got involved with what was Dress the West, the wearable art exhibition. They started telling local stories through wearable art, which then kind of rolled over into this idea that they might be able to tell the local story called Martia, which is the story of the sun and moon. It's the most beautiful story. It's a tear-jerking story. When we heard it, we were just, whoa! But what they then realized was that sharing that small story locally was able to be grown into a much larger event, which was the opening event for the Tree of Knowledge Festival in Barcaldine. So within the space of maybe 18 months, it may have been even shorter than that, they were able to grow this really small idea into a much larger innovation that opened a public festival. And they had people not only from the local area come in and hear that story, but of course that central west area of Queensland is prime grey nomad territory. And at that point, it was only one of a handful of places that we could travel to very freely in Queensland. So that now they've got not only a Queensland perspective, but a national perspective on the possibility of what their art form and their stories might be able to do. The other thing around this notion of thrivability is that what we're seeing is from our participants in the communities, and particularly from the local mayors that we're talking to, and we have a real favourite, we shouldn't say that, but we do, a mayor by the name of Andrew Martin, who is the mayor of Blackall Tambo, who was a 6th generation sheep farmer, but has got this extraordinary capacity to engage and create arts, culture and creative experiences with and for his community. And he and other mayors talk about the infrastructure is important, but it's not key, it's the people. And if you invest in the people rather than the buildings, you get a sustainable arts and cultural, not scene, but ecology within those towns and communities. So what we're seeing is everything has to be people-centered first and infrastructure-centered second. And that's really key because it's beginning to tell local councils where they should invest their dollars. And their dollars are in people and the art experiences people rather than buildings that might sit empty for quite some time. The other thing that we notice, and there are 2 quotes on that slide from 2 of our participants, is that they understand that these sites, because of their isolation and because of some of the long-term problems that Donna described, are prime sites for entrepreneurship. And one of the examples I will give you is in Northwest Tasmania in Burnie. And if anybody knows the history of Burnie, you will know that it was once a town that had a very large pulp mill that closed down in the 1980s. And this pulp mill provided the majority of employment in that town. It closed down in the 80s. Midnight Oil wrote a song about it called Burnie. And the entire town took an economic, that it just plummeted. And people were living on or very close to the poverty line. And what that town decided to do was not to situate themselves completely in that area of really deep, intractable problems, but to use it as an opportunity to rethink what that town was. And what they have done over the last 10 years or more, 20 years it is now since the pulp mill closed, was to use the idea of paper as a key. And they created this idea of the city of makers. And out of that springs this, it's a workshop really right on the waterfront called Creative Paper, where they are now making bespoke papers to sell internationally. As a result of that creative paper and that city of makers idea, springs up another fashion festival, which is based in wearable art. We didn't know these two things existed, but they just serendipitously appeared on our radar. And that festival has now been running for a very, very long time and has entrants from all over the world who really vie to get into it. It's seen as one of the most prestigious wearable art festivals anywhere in the world. So going from a position of something that could be quite detrimental, that town has turned itself around. I do have to say that that town is now undergoing another rethink. The local government is creating a new strategy, and that city of makers and that creative paper idea that has now supported Bernie so well for so long may not be the thing that drives the town forward. So we're watching that really closely. The other thing to say is that both the Central West and Northwest Tasmania understand that hyperlocal is really important, and that it's because of the natural landscape, the histories of those landscapes, the knowledges of those landscapes, the beauties of those landscapes, that they are able to create art products that work at national and even international level. But the hyperlocality is the key. And in Central West, we often talk about heritage arts practices. So it's that continuity of the past to create the future. And this is really key when we talk about possible futures. And here I'm not just talking about those people who've been in communities for a long time, but I'm particularly thinking of our young people that are in those communities. These are towns and cities and groups of people who've been dominated by highly agricultural and industrial histories. And what we're beginning to see, particularly through our young people who are engaging in these projects, is that they understand that there's another possible way of living their life. They don't have to live a farming existence. They don't have to live an industrial existence, but they're understanding that the arts are a possible avenue for employment. And very quickly, just to share an idea there for you, there is a group that's centred around Northwest Tasmania, a group that people in Australia will be familiar with, Big Heart, which was created and is anchored in Northwest Tasmania. They have a project called Project O, which is a project that supports young women who have experienced domestic and family violence. And it's through arts practices that those young women are able to transform their futures. And we were very, very fortunate when we were in Northwest Tasmania at the beginning of this year to employ some of those young women who are now filmmakers in their own right, very skilled, because of the work that they've done locally with Project O and Big Heart, that we've employed them as filmmakers and artists on our project, which means they've got an economic future through their artwork. Donna, to finish up.
Thank you, Sandra. So I'll just quickly go through the emerging commonalities because we're really interested in having a conversation and answering any questions at the end. So I'm sure you're starting to see that we have emerging themes and that there are commonalities across both of our sides. And to distill those, what we're seeing is that place is really central, but place is more than geography. Although both of these areas have really dramatic, beautiful geography. They're both landscapes that I love very much. And I actually grew up in the central west of Queensland, as did our project manager, Sasha Mackay. And when we go out to central west Queensland, there's something about that landscape that always just feels like home to me. And I also, love the dramatic landscape of northwest Tasmania, but it's more than that geography, that they understand that place is made up of the people and the history alongside that physical landscape, and that all of these elements together are central to their identity and sense of belonging in those communities, that the people who they know and care about, the histories of those towns and the place and this, the landscape that they live in, all come together in really potent and profound ways in each of those communities that are quite unique. So the place is really important. We're also seeing that arts and culture, like place, and as I said before, are not something that sit in the background. They're not something to do. Arts, culture and creativity are how the community sees itself and its future, which ties in directly to what Sandra just said. And we're starting to really see that there is just a great deal for us to learn from regional, rural and remote communities in particular about their commitment to creatively and collectively harness their local resources and culture to ensure that their communities are able to grow and thrive together. That success for one needs to be success for everybody, which is part of that grassroots activities as being a really crucial part of the growth and thriving of the communities. And then finally, that also what sits alongside all of this is an understanding and a sense that arts, culture and creativity and the activities and the projects associated with them offer really inclusive, safe, non-threatening spaces for people to come together, to be able to talk about particular issues, to understand how their community is working and their place in it. And particularly during COVID, this has become really clear that local communities, and we've seen it just really strongly in the Central West through RAPID and the Central West Aboriginal Corporation, of using those local cultural assets to really speak to community members around staying safe, about community safety and health, and also to speak to them about vaccines and any hesitancy that might be in the community as well, in a really safe way with people that they already trust, talking to them about these issues. And we're seeing that replicated, and certainly internationally, there's a really strong body of evidence around the usefulness and integral nature of arts and culture to be able to address some of those public health issues that we're seeing really emerge from COVID. So just finally, last page, that's Penguin in Penguin, outside, just outside of Burnie, and we never get tired of seeing that giant penguin, really we don't. And so if you want to keep in touch with us, that's the website for the social impact, regional arts and social impact. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Thanks, Donna. Just such an extraordinary body of work, and so diverse, which is really fascinating. It's not just sitting in one kind of arts form or another. It's really quite broad. So just wondering if we've got some questions. I've got one that I'd love to ask to kick us off. But Vic, you've got a point you've made there, which kind of looks like a question. Do you want to unmute and put words to that?
Sure. Thanks very much, and thanks for the presentation. I was interested in your focus on Burnie and the recent decision to close a lot of those amazing initiatives, and just whether that kind of hyper-local rejection is one way you might sort of look at some of those decisions that were made, and whether you're looking at that in the next stages of your research.
Hi, Vic. You and I met each other at the beginning of the year when we were on a panel together in Burnie. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, we met there in Burnie. That's correct.
Yeah, we did on a stage very briefly. Yeah, look, we are following that very, very closely. I mean, Donna and I guess we can say in this forum, are quite devastated with the way in which there is, as you described, a possible rejection of the hyperlocal, simply because that City of Makers kind of branding has been so strong and has galvanized so many local groups. And it's no coincidence that, you know, just up the road in Devonport, a lot of the big cruise ships come in now. Of course, they're not there at the moment, but then one of the things they always used to do was track down to Burnie because of that creative paper centre and Burnie Regional Gallery and all of that kind of extraordinary work that was being done there. I get a sense that, you know, that is at risk of being lost, but we do know that those groups, particularly the Burnie Arts Council and Big Heart, are really advocating very, very strongly for that continued recognition. But yes, we're keen to go back down there and find out how it's going. And that has to be part of our report because it's part of that sustainability question. And just quickly,
just say that.
Oh, sorry, Vic.
No, that's right. You go, Donna.
I was just going to say it's. We were just looking at all of the footage from Burnie this last week, and all of the hours of footage of interviews and the community engagement. And, you know, it was quite poignant, actually, people talking about the Makers Centre, and that was from back in March, and knowing that it had closed. And we did that. We actually did the community engagement in the Burnie Regional Gallery as well. So it was quite, you know, poignant watching that and feeling quite devastated. But one of the things that did come out really strongly is that, you know, that focus on people, that the people in that community are still incredibly driven, and that resource of people, I think, will transcend some of this, you know, some of this disruption and short-sightedness that's occurring at the moment.
Totally agree. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Vic.
Pleasure.
So I've got a question about that mayor that talked about infrastructure and human infrastructure, which I think is such a lovely way to think about the kind of ways we spend public money. We're often spending it on roads, and of course, roads matter. You can't get from A to B in these communities without roads. But the idea that human infrastructure is also an important resource. I wonder if you've got any reflections on how we make that view mainstream, how we make that so, you know, the kind of conservative politics potentially and Labor politics sees that as something that's worth investing in because it's investing in people. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, it's kind of really prescient actually at the moment that there's as part of my Fulbright project next year, willing if I get overseas, that part of the really big infrastructure bill that's being passed in the States at the moment counts arts and culture as infrastructure, and also counts caring and all of these other ephemeral parts that keep our society going as infrastructure. And part of one of the projects that is attached to the research centre that I'll be spending time with is working as part of that bill with a big philanthropic organisation to think about how arts and culture can be at the centre of rebuilding an economy and social cohesion. So the two things that COVID and the kind of, you know, falling apart of trust in, you know, in democracy that it has occurred there, and I think we're probably seeing mirrored here, the ways in which arts and culture needs to be at the centre of rebuilding economy and social cohesion, which obviously you can't separate as well, and public health. So it is occurring in North America slowly. It's also being trialled in the UK and the EU around projects such as social prescribing. So it is, but I I think Australia is so far behind in this that it almost shocks me when there's so much good work happening in small projects with great people in this country that bigger picture is just lacking. And
can I just add on to that, Michael? Often in this project, we talk about tangible and intangible assets. And tangible assets are, you know, those physical infrastructures that we see, you know, the art gallery, the small local concert hall, you know, public art that is very evident in Central Western Queensland, those kind of things. I think what we actually have to do in our projects is be very, very clear about the dollar value of knowledge, that arts-based knowledge that people bring to those projects, and start to think, how do we cost that out? You know, we cost people's time, but we don't cost their knowledge, and that's an intangible asset. And particularly if you're working, you know, with First Nations people, we often, we meaning, you know, if we are non-Indigenous creating a project, sometimes forget that the intangible knowledge that our Indigenous art making colleagues bring to those projects actually need to be remunerated, because it's an asset. So if we can begin to work out how we dollar value those, that will change the rhetoric for the government. That's not the remit of this project, but it's something that we should begin to talk about in terms of looking at government policy.
I just want to pick up. Thanks, Sandra. That's really that's I think really speaks to the zeitgeist at the moment about how we value things, which is a bit tragic, but you know, it does speak to that. Donna, I just want to pick up on something you said, which was the kind of getting beyond the small case studies. Now, there's no denying small case studies have got a fantastic role to play, but I think if you look at the arts arts education in general, we're overweighed by small case studies and not enough on the other end. I wonder how you see your project responding to that imbalance, and whether you've got any other thoughts about what the field might do to get beyond that.
Well, as I think when Sandra started talking about the project, it became clear that for us it was not going to be discipline specific and issue specific. So as much as there's been great work done with looking at this particular discipline, music or dance, working in conjunction with this particular social issue or public health issue, that we wanted to look at that much bigger picture of arts, culture and creativity as something that's community-led. So rather than us talking about what are the disciplines or art forms in communities, looking at as that ecosystem, what are the very different ways that different communities start to articulate and share arts, culture and creativity. So I think part of it is getting away from disciplines, as when we talk to communities and talk about arts, culture and creativity instead of the arts or theatre making or music, because then a whole lot of people say, well, that's not what I do, or that's not for me, but allow that to bubble up a little bit more so that there's a broader, expansive, inclusive way of thinking about arts, culture and creativity. And then the next is really, and it's something that we're really passionate about, is this sort of cross-sector collaboration. We need to be open to working with public health, with schools, with economic development boards, and to maybe be a little less, I'm about to start going on, right? Be a little less precious about the arts being able to be useful without that diminishing or diluting the beauty and the profound, the profound nature of the arts as well. They can be both of those things at the same time. They can be interdisciplinary, they can be useful, they can be applied, and they can be completely wonderful as art objects and art outputs as well. And we need to get past that.
Thanks, Donna. Great. Some interesting stuff on the chat. Karen talking about how there's a kind of a requirement almost for overqualification of artists. Absolutely. Olivia asks whether this will be available. Yep, it'll be available on our YouTube channel and the links in the chat. Any last questions or comments before we roll up tonight?
It's just that artists have more qualifications than most professionals, but are not paid anywhere near.
Absolutely.
Australia Council, yeah. Research.
Yeah, thanks, Karen.
That's all right. And the latest research is that creativity is supposed to help children with their HSC marks better than anything else. I just heard that on the Radio National last week. And it was research.
Thanks, Karen.
Good to know. I'll disappear now.
Okay, well, that's been such a stimulating discussion about the kinds of things. I mean, the thing I love about this work is it's so hopeful in a world which is kind of in great need of hope. It's such a hopeful piece of work. And so it chimes with so many things the Create Centre's kind of doing with different arts organisations. So more power to your arms, Sandra and Donna. Thank you so much for bringing this work to us. And what we would really love to see is, if it's okay with you, is to hear back kind of frequently. So this can become kind of a feature of your work. We'd love to have you back to tell us about where this work has got to, because I think it's critical work and it's hopeful work and it's an exciting work. So congratulations to you both, and really look forward to hearing the next chapter.
And as I said at the beginning, Michael, on behalf of Donna and myself, thank you very much to yourself and Robin for the very generous invitation. We've really appreciated it.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Well, that's it for tonight. Have a great night, and look forward to seeing you at another Create event. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.